Hello, welcome back to COM 340 Rhetoric and Popular Culture. And today we're going to be talking about constitutive rhetoric or constitutive rhetoric, some people might call it. And this is a rhetorical concept that goes in depth and tries to explore specifically the ways in which rhetoric can call a group into being or serve as an item that creates an identity for an audience. For instance, the Constitution of the United States of America and the Declaration of Independence are often looked at as two documents that help create the idea of what America is. And by understanding the ways in which texts do this and artifacts do this, we can better understand how we form our identities, and in particular, the messages and artifacts, material artifacts, that make up the signs and symbols of our identifications. This is important in popular culture because we are constantly bombarded with images of branding and identity. And if we don't understand the ways in which these artifacts are trying to get us to identify as customers of brands or people who need certain products, then we are way more, you could say, at risk of being very easily persuaded by these messages. Uh, and it gives you the power to make better choices if you understand the ways in which these things work, which is why I think it's important to talk about it when we're talking about understanding and analyzing popular culture. Uh, Here's an example. I'll let you watch it on your own so we don't get a strike, another strike from YouTube. But it's basically the last scene from The Breakfast Club. And outside of awkwardly making out in front of your parents, one thing this scene does that's interesting is it shows us their essay that they end up writing together for the detention that they're in. And the essay says you wanted us to each write our own paper about who we are, but principal guy, where do you get off on asking us to do that? We found out that we're all a brain and a popular person and a criminal, and that they all contain the multitudes that each of their tropic identities present, basically. And this, I think, is a fun example of constitutive rhetoric because it represents the ways in which that essay can serve as sort of a flag post for the identity, the group identity created by their experiences together that day. That this piece of messaging, that this piece of rhetoric serves as the thing they can point to and say, at least on that one day, we were all together as a unit, and this represents that moment in time. We can look back at this and remember how we were grouped together, which is basically how constitutive rhetoric works. So if we look at a basic definition in its simplest form, how we can understand constitutive rhetoric and how it operates, it's essentially rhetoric that creates an audience and culture around itself. It defines that audience and helps create that culture around it. And it does this by calling into existence a common collective identity. In other words, an artifact has the potential to inspire a group of people to recognize similarities, or for the people to connect to a group because it's been described such that they are connected to it. And we can analyze the artifacts and the material artifacts of that group to understand the ways in which people are brought into it. Where does this notion of constitutive rhetoric come from? It comes from a couple of places. One, if we think back to the sophists, the idea that rhetoric has the ability to bring people together, at the very least in opinion, is not particularly controversial. I mean, you had people, the sophists, traveling as rhetorical I was going to say scholars, but it's more like rhetorical tutors for people, teaching them how to make good arguments and preparing them to go and argue their case in the forum and win whatever disputes that they might have. But the sophists understood that communication has direct impact on the ways in which we understand ourselves. And so you need to be careful and tailor your messages. The reason that's important to note is because Plato and Socrates were not into those ideas at all. They thought that there was a capital T truth, a capital G good, and that by pursuing wisdom uh, and knowing things, that you could get closer to that good, that you can get closer to that wisdom. And they thought sophists, in teaching people how to argue that the weaker case was a stronger case, were teaching people how to be manipulative. As someone who defines rhetoric favorably, I think we can agree that we've sort of evolved past that understanding of rhetoric that Plato and Socrates had. We also have Kenneth Burke, whose ideas sort of contribute to the notion of constitutive rhetoric, in that identification is an important part of persuasion. Burke, in fact, calls it the substrate, the thing from which persuasion is born out of. Um, and identifying with an audience is about recognizing the connection that you have with them, recognizing the things that you have in common, and using that to help bolster the effectiveness of your persuasion. So if we can change things with persuasion, and if we can reveal the ways in which we're connected to people with persuasion, then we can connect ourselves and our messages with other people through the ways in which we construct our messages, which is a pretty powerful idea. And James Boyd White essentially coins the term constitutive rhetoric in 1985 and writes on it. And also the concept of narratives, right? We tell ourselves stories in order to situate not only who we are, but what we are. There's a lot that we don't know about the world as a scientific fact, right? We're not sure why we yawn. We don't have a great idea of why we have dreams. And to figure those things out, we tell ourselves stories. We also tell ourselves stories and narratives about certain historical events as sort of a shorthand for learning them. For instance, Benjamin Franklin did not fly a kite in a lightning storm with a key attached. If he would have, that was a good way to get shocked to death. Lots of people die via lightning. Newton didn't get the idea for gravity because an apple fell on his head. He got the idea for gravity because he studied the physical world very intently. And so we get all these notions and concepts through stories. But we also know who we are based on the stories that we tell ourselves, whether it's a story that the family has about sort of what it means to be a member about a particular family, or to be a member of a team, or a member of a fandom. We have stories that sort of explain those things, and those stories connect people, but they also give you something to know, tangible knowledge, that also connects you to the group. So it's not just that the story reveals the kind of person that the group contains, but also the history of the group as well. One example of this that I think is particularly interesting is on the show Cheer. And throughout the course of the show, you see that one thing they require of new members is that they know the history of other former members of that squad and the different runs that they did in the different national championship routines. That's extreme, right? That's an extreme request to make of your team members, but it's done in the service of creating a strong in-group and using knowledge and narrative to help create that group, such that the history of the team becomes a rhetorical artifact for group identification. And then if you don't know about the team, you don't care about the history, you're not really a member. So cheer can help you understand constitutive rhetoric and identification, which is why studying pop culture is so great. As we move forward in the slideshow, if it allows us, there's lots of examples that we have of constitutive rhetoric, right? There's lots of examples that we have of rhetoric organizing us. It happens all the time and putting us into categories. It happens so often that we probably don't notice, and especially in rhetoric from popular culture. If we identify a certain way, we're more likely to do the things associated with that identity. So of course, advertisers and TV shows want us to identify certain ways. Another group of people that want us to identify with certain groups, political rhetoric is all about getting people to identify a certain way and to connect with a certain way of thinking. The pessimistic view on this is that they're talking to their idealized constituents and not real constituents, or that they talk a good game but eventually are revealed to be beholden to the people contributing to their campaign the most. But politics certainly attempts to build an identity around their supporters, where I believe this, therefore I should vote for this party. But in the rhetoric that they use, it's all about building support and building a connection around the messaging, the ideas. And oftentimes not the actual policy decisions, because that's harder to convince people that you care about their concerns when you're doing certain things. Narratives, of course, we just talked about them, but specifically the ways in which histories, myths, and fictions function. If you can control these things, you can control what people think about them. And the stories that you tell about things can unite people together in positive ways and negative ways. And so the narratives that we have and that we believe about ourselves and about our histories are vitally important to understanding who we are and who we try to make ourselves into. We also have symbolic attachment, and by that, what I mean is if you are a member of a group, you likely have lots of symbols that connect you to that group, whether it's wearing a certain color or wearing certain letters or saying certain phrases. Symbolic attachment serves to create a feeling of belonging through your participation in that symbol. Think of graduation, right? Once you've participated in that symbol, we've attached a lot of meaning to that symbol of receiving your degree and your handshake and walking across the stage and having your name read aloud. That's a symbol that you have graduated, you have ascended into a group and now have alumnus status, right? But we also have really broad examples of that as well, like the color crimson or saying roll tide. Those are also symbolic attachments to a group. It's just that those groups are very large and, like I said, very broad in their membership. One thing that I find fascinating about rhetoric is the way in which the same message can change over time. Now, the University of Alabama has the campaign Where Legends Are Made. It's an award-winning campaign. I'm not a huge fan of it, but I appreciate the branding, and I appreciate that it's visible. And again, I'm going to have to let you watch these clips on your own in the slide version of this. But if you watch them, you can see how the message develops over time. This campaign's not new. It's existed since at least 2016. But as we release new commercials, the messaging tends to change. For instance, this one's from 2017, and it essentially says that we work together as a community to become legends and contributors to society. A great message. And I like to think that we do that we are co-creators of the eventual legend of your achievement. Roll Tide, and maybe we'll play Celebrating Achievement on Denny Chimes for you someday. So it's a nice positive message. That message changes a little bit in 2017, where instead of we're all working together to become legends on the University of Alabama campus, this ad essentially states that only so many people will ever truly become legends. And also, there is the University of Alabama. It doesn't explicitly state that if you come to the University of Alabama, the classes here, the environment here will propel you to become a legend, but it essentially implies that. Um, and then we get the 2019 version, which I think with just a few edits is still the 2020 version. I saw this ad several times uh, Saturday night during the game, but it goes from you might think you know Alabama, showing clips of um, the football team practicing and also the uh, rowing team, the crew. Um, but then it goes on to show, well, there's other things as well, such as there's famous artists and authors that have worked here and gone here to the University of Alabama. So we are also these other things as well, which is funny because the university, if you've been around a little bit like I have, has worked very hard to become an R1 institution. R1 is the highest classification of research institution that colleges can get. And the University of Alabama has that because it focused on it over the last however many years, turning itself into a very respectable school and propelling it into the top, comfortably, I think now, into the top 50 colleges and universities in the country. So if you're a student at the University of Alabama, you're going to a good school. It just so happens, though, that our national profile in things like athletics or as a symbol of civil rights struggle existed before we were such a good school. And so people have a conception of Alabama that, you know, outlasts its academic reputation, which is growing, by the year. And so to say, you might think you know Alabama from our national sports profile, and then to talk about, but we also have other things you've heard about as well, without talking about how we have the number one PR program in the country, or a great business school, incredible nursing school, excellent law school, right? Pretty great speech team, if I say so myself, right? We have all of these things, but it's sort of focusing on things that people would know, which is fine, right? Especially if you're broadcasting to a broad audience and you're trying to create a sense of group identity around the University of Alabama, you want to catch people where they are, right? And if you know about Forrest Gump, right? If you know about The Help and those authors' connections to the University of Alabama, then you might be more likely to want to attend here. But it's interesting that in showing there's more to us than just the things you already know about us due to our place in history, that they don't go to, oh, by the way, we're pretty good school now and have been for a little bit. It's just an interesting take. As we go forward and keep talking about constitutive rhetoric, we'll talk more specifically about the tenets of constitutive rhetoric, the checklist for things to analyze it, and we'll also discuss the way in which constitutive rhetoric and its tactics are used, in particular in branding, to create a bigger connection between us and the brands that we purchase from. All right, thanks a lot, and as always, roll tide.